Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 28 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Buffalo Sabres, in which the Sharks have lost 6-3. So this game concludes this Eastern Canada / Buffalo road trip that the Sharks have been on. I include Buffalo in sort of the Eastern Canada umbrella because they seem to be honorarily Canadian in a way, as they do sing the Canadian national anthem at the beginning of the game. But anyhow, this was a road trip that the Sharks were probably expecting to do at least a decent bit better on. The Sharks going into this road trip had certainly improved their play, and they would be going up against, yes, the Leafs are a strong team, but the other three teams, the Sabres, Senators, and Canadiens, all pretty bad and likely not to make the playoffs this season. And so the Sharks definitely were hoping to, at the very least, split a tough road trip, a tough road trip in terms of travel, and potentially even go 3-1, and yet they end up with a 1-3 record. They took it to the Montreal Canadiens in the first game of the road trip with that shutout victory, but then lost the last three. And at the very least, the game against Toronto was decently close. The Sharks played pretty well, and just a couple crucial mistakes at the end caused them to lose that one. And against the Senators, there were just some hiccups on the power play. They just didn't penalty kill particularly well, and that's why they lost, but at even strength, they played a decent game. Here tonight, they were just pretty much multiple steps behind the Sabres at essentially every facet of this game. Their even strength play was pretty disappointing. Their penalty killing play was pretty disappointing. Their power play was not terrible, but not that amazing either, even though they did get the one goal from the second power play unit, which I'll get to a bit later. Generally, this was just a pretty bad game from San Jose, and you could say it's somewhat expected. It is indeed the end of this Eastern Canada road trip, and it is on the second half of a back-to-back. They played against the Senators just yesterday, so it's kind of a setup game to lose, but even so, you were hoping for at least a somewhat better performance than what the Sharks gave, because this game was not necessarily all that close for much of it. But let's start off in the first period. Once again, the Sharks, they give up a power play goal here tonight. 2 power play goals actually, to go with the 3 in the previous one. So this penalty kill that was just a few days ago we were singing the praises of has suddenly kind of fallen off a cliff a bit. It is Thompson putting the Sabres up in the lead. But just like yesterday's game against the Senators, the Sharks actually hold a lead at the end of the first period because they get goals from Nick Bonino as well as Kevin Labanc on the second power play unit. I've talked about in the past, the second power play unit is essentially just there to play like the last 30 seconds of a power play when the first power play unit doesn't really get it done, because the second power play unit features players like Bonino, who coming into this game had 0 goals on the season, and Cunnin and Matt Benning, who's not really a power play guy. But Labanc is probably the most power play inclined player in this situation, and he manages to score the goal. So the Sharks do have that 2-1 lead at the end of the first period, but just like yesterday, they blew this lead, and it starts in the second period where they give up a pretty early goal within the first few seconds of the second period to Peterka to get the game tied up. Then relatively quickly after, the Sabres make it 3-2, and then after that 4-2 with another power play goal, and suddenly the Sharks go from leading by 1 to trailing by 2 at the end of 40 minutes. Now, we have seen at times this season the Sharks have actually been pretty good in situations down by a couple of goals in the third period, but that was not really the case here tonight. The Sabres add another goal to make it 5-2. The Sharks do quickly respond with an Oscar Lindblom goal to make it 5-3, but eventually, once the goaltender gets pulled, the Sabres score, they make it 6-3, and that is the end of the game. So the Sharks will head back to San Jose with this 1-3 road trip under this belt, and a pretty important one as we sort of are around that Thanksgiving to early Christmas time where you're expecting teams to kind of really solidify themselves in a playoff race. And currently the Sharks find themselves 31st in the league in terms of points percentage, which makes you believe that this is not a playoff team unless something insanely drastic, miracle type of St. Louis in 2019 run actually occurs, as we move into Christmas and the new year. On to the players to talk about on the first line. We have Meyer, Hertl, and Labanc. A relatively disappointing game from this first line, and clearly I'm not the only one who thought this, as David Quinn, for the first time in what feels like a very long time, actually experimented with his top 2 lines. Prior to that, Meyer, Hertl, and Labanc had been together for like a a dozen games, it feels like, and the same goes for Barabanov, Couture, and Nieto. But Meier actually ended up getting moved down to the second line with Barabanov and Couture. At least he took a few shifts with them in that third period. So it'll be interesting to see once the Sharks do return for their next game, whether or not we get a new look to this Sharks top six. Because like I said, this first line, a pretty disappointing game. There wasn't really much doing here at all. LeBanc, a couple of miscued passes, didn't necessarily look super apparent, but outside of his power play goal, Hertl had a couple of okay looks, but nothing amazing. And then Meier was essentially just taking a lot of shots from the outside, never necessarily finding that middle part. So a pretty powerless game from this top line. However, the second line, I will say, was definitely better. I thought Barabanov and Couture were probably two of the better forwards for the San Jose Sharks on the night, probably two of the best forwards for the Sharks, I should say. Nieto, not necessarily as much of a factor. I felt as though it was much more the Barabanov-Couture show, but Nieto was sort of there, and so it was definitely a pretty solid game from the second line, I would say, and probably their best line as well, if you don't really count the fourth line, which I don't really, though I'll get to them a bit later. When it comes to the third line, this was a pretty interesting one because I remember early in the first period I was watching this third line. Nick Bonino made a pretty nice play and pass to Luke Kunin, a bit too far out of his reach, but it was the thought that counts. And I remember thinking, oh, is this going to be a Nick Bonino good game, a very rare Nick Bonino good game? And then the immediate shift after that, he actually managed to score his first goal of the season here in game 28. And so suddenly, I guess he hasn't played all 28 games, but it is the Sharks' 28th game of the year. And so suddenly I was thinking, okay, this is going to be a good game for this third line. Yes, Gregor ends up being out of the lineup, I believe, due to injury, and Svechnikov comes in, but Bonino and Kunin are going to carry it here. And, well, that didn't actually end up happening. Past the first period, this third line didn't really do much of anything and was a bit of a liability at times. So there was some false hope early on in this game, and Bonino did score a goal, which is quite nice, but in the end, it turns out that this carriage was indeed made out of pumpkins, and so there really wasn't much there. When it comes to the fourth line, a rare, strong game from the Sharks' fourth line. Nothing amazing to write home about, but of course there is a goal here. Oscar Lindblom scores his first goal of the season. I believe he has played 27 games of the 28 that the Sharks have had, so his first goal coming now is not good. You might be thinking, well, 27 games, one goal for a fourth liner, that's not the end of the world, even if you're expecting slightly better. But remember, Lindblom was not signed to be a fourth liner. He was signed to be, at the very least, a third liner who could potentially flex up into the top six. He's making $2.5 million this year and next. And so the fact that he's going to be on pace for like 2 or 3 goals on this particular season is not a very good sign, and especially since of those 27 games, it's not as though he's been snake bitten and he's been so close to getting the goal, and this is the one that's going to open the floodgates. He's been mostly invisible, and I'd say about 22 of the 27 games that he has played, and that's maybe even being slightly generous. And as such, even though this was a nice game from the fourth line, Gadjevich has actually looked pretty decent these past couple of games. Lindblom does score that goal. I'm not necessarily expecting any sort of consistent performance from these three players until they show me something that's going to happen otherwise. When it comes to the defensemen, I once again thought Karlsson was pretty good here tonight. The defensive game definitely left a bit to be desired. We did see not the massive, terrible sort of puck in the back of his own net type of mistakes from Erik Karlsson, but he did look at times a bit too lost defensively, especially considering he did start this road trip in that particular area rather well. But on the offensive side of things, Erik Karlsson was still making some stuff happen. Not as good as he was in the previous one yesterday against the Ottawa Senators, but still decently solid. It just was not enough here tonight. The Sharks, of course, gave up 6 goals, and their defense is at least partially to blame for that. If we actually take a look at some of these goals, 2 of them, of course, were on the power play, and a couple of them were ones that Dell would want back for sure, like the Peterka one. But we look at this third goal from Buffalo, and this was really the first goal from Peterka there, or the second goal, I guess, technically, that tied the game. Not the end of the world, but that third goal definitely hurts, and it is Nick Cicek who's coming back, sort of not necessarily on the back check, because of course he is the defenseman, but he ends up crashing into Aaron Dell, taking him out of the play, and this allows the Sabres to get the lead lead, and a lead that they would never relinquish for the rest of the game. And so it has just been kind of a series of comical almost errors from the Sharks defensemen over these past couple of games that have allowed the other team to constantly rack up these pretty high goal totals. 5 goals last night against the Senators, 6 goals against here tonight against the Buffalo Sabres, and it again stems from some of these major mistakes. And it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier on in the season, where none of these defensemen individually are necessarily that great, besides Erik Karlsson, of course. But with the system that David Quinn has established, they are actually allowed to sort of shine in a way, not necessarily as a sort of, wow, this player really stands out as being very good, but shine in that these guys are pretty decent defensively. But when it comes sort of like still these gaffes type of happening because of the fact that they're just not naturally all that amazing defenseman, it does make you realize like, oh, okay, this is indeed a Sharks defensive core that is one of the worst in the leagues on paper, and is a big reason for why the Sharks are not necessarily going to be able to make the playoffs this season. But then finally we have the goaltender here, Aaron Dell, after a very solid first game of the season for the San Jose Sharks against the Toronto Maple Leafs a few days ago. He gets another opportunity in the second half of a back-to-back here against his former team, the Buffalo Sabres, and it did not go particularly well. Yes, he didn't have much of a chance on a couple of these goals, like the Thompson one and the second one there from Quinn, on the 2-on-1 type of situation. And then, of course, the goal scored where he gets taken out completely by Cicek. But definitely the Peterka one is one that he should absolutely have. The first Quinn goal on the power play wasn't completely impossible to stop. And so generally, this is a combination of, yes, the Sharks defense in front of him did no favors, but you let in 5 goals. It's never really going to be a good night for you. And so Dell, not so great. The Sharks certainly going to be waiting with bated breath for when Reimer will return from that injury. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday. They will finally return home after an extended trip here, like I mentioned, to Eastern Canada. And we'll see. I mean, they haven't really been particularly good at home thus far this season, but they also necessarily haven't been that great in general. So maybe we'll see what happens, I guess. Class dismissed.